Belgorod, Russia, 1943. The 4th of July dawned hot and sticky. Throughout the morning, bursts of thundery rain sent troops under their ground sheets and wrapped the landscape in a steamy haze. West of Belgorod, an expected silence fell over the front line. The assault forces of the 48th Panzer and 2nd SS Panzer Corps waited tensely in the trenches for the signal to attack. SS Obergrenadier Lance Corporal Gunther Borkers found time to write in his diary, quote, "I am in a flamethrowing team, and we are to lead the company attack. This is a real suicide mission. We have to get within 30 meters of the Russians before we can open fire. It's time to write the last will and testament." End quote. And that was from Robin Cross's book, Zitadelle, The Battle of Kursk. Thus began the Battle of Kursk, a clash during the Second World War that has been called the greatest tank battle in history. A titanic conflict of armor and weaponry unseen in warfare before or since. That's its reputation anyway. But the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was much more than just a tank slug. It was also a key turning point, not necessarily in the progress of the war on the Eastern Front, but in the thinking of commanders on all sides in this enormous, complex war. And that's what we're going to get into today. Welcome to episode 52 of Beyond Barbarossa, the first English language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting as usual from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe territory, also called Ottawa, Canada. And I'm joined in the studio today by my two stalwart assistants, Ragnar the Magnificent and Daisy the Doodle, a large cat and a silly dog. What would I do without them? So if you hear any weird little noises, I'm going to blame it on them. Last episode was the opening of Season 3. So welcome again to Season 3 of this podcast. I never really thought about getting this deep into it. But anyway, here we are. And so last episode described the build-up to the Battle of Kursk. If you don't recall it, it might be a good idea to pause this episode and flip back to that one and refresh your memory, and then come back immediately to this. Anyway, quick recap though. The Battle of Stalingrad and following German and Soviet operations on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943 had produced a more or less smooth front line on the Eastern Front, that slanted from Leningrad in the north to the Sea of Azov in the south. Smooth with one big exception. A huge bulge over 100 kilometers long and 80 kilometers wide between Orel and Belgorod, roughly centered on the city of Kursk, Russia. I covered all that and more last episode. So, as I say, if you need to, please go back and refresh your memory. Now, in March 1943, looking at this bulge in the line, Kurt Zeitzler, the new Chief of Staff of the German High Command, the OKW, along with Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and others, proposed an offensive, a huge pincer movement to strike from the north and south of this bulge or salient, and encircle Red armies within it. This would reduce the numbers of Soviet forces, now at about 6.5 million men and women, as well as restore German military prestige. That had been radically diminished after their stunning losses in Stalingrad and in North Africa. Politically, this would prove to be a very difficult time for German dictator Adolf Hitler. For decades, he had been shouting the idea that Germans were superior people, especially militarily, and particularly superior to what he called Slavs. He had promised that the German armies would take Moscow within 6 weeks, starting in June 1941. And here they are, 2 full years later, nowhere near the Soviet capital. Germany's Hungarian and Romanian allies are unhappy, mostly because their armies had been destroyed along with the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. And the Italians are also wavering. Rumors swirl about Mussolini seeking a separate peace with the Allies or being overthrown by his own party. So, according to a lot of historians, Hitler believed he needed a victory to restore German prestige and quell her allies' fears. On top of that, in the spring of 1943, the Germans were rightly worried about an Allied operation, an invasion of Europe somewhere in the Mediterranean. Then, in April 1943, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, learned that the body of a British naval officer had been found in the Mediterranean Sea. And in a pocket of the uniform, there was a memo that mentioned Allied plans for invading Crete. This was a deception. It was called Operation Mincemeat, dreamt up partly by one Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming. He apparently would go on to write a series of novels featuring a certain British secret agent with a license to kill. But let's focus on 1943. So the Germans are in a very different place politically, psychologically, and militarily than they were in 1941. They're now fighting and losing on 2 fronts. And they're worried about a new front opening up in Europe, which Stalin had been demanding for 2 years now. And now there's a body in the Mediterranean with the plans for invading Southern Europe. Even if it's a deception, which doubtlessly someone in Germany must have suspected, what is not doubtable is that the Western Allies would invade somewhere in the Mediterranean. So, what can the Germans do about all this? By April 1943, Hitler is persuaded to go ahead with the planning of Operation Zitadelle, or Citadel, a 2-pronged attack from the northern and southern corners of the Kursk salient. The Germans begin to build up an immense attacking force at the northern and southern corners, where the front lines bulge out from its roughly north-south orientation toward the west. The plan is for the 2 groups to penetrate Soviet defenses here and link up east of Kursk, isolating and capturing millions of Soviet troops. Those not killed would be taken prisoner and shipped west to be used as slave labor, which the Nazis need in their war material factories to produce ammunition and weapons, because so many German men are fighting in the armed forces or just dead. This was an incredibly ambitious plan because each of the 2 forces would have to advance 80 to 100 kilometers to link up. Field Marshal von Manstein developed the operational plan. He wanted to start as soon as the Berezina or Rasputitsa, the season of no roads, when the mud is so thick it swallows whole vehicles. When that ended, as soon as the ground got hard enough, the panzers would move. But Hitler, before the Rasputitsa was over, delayed the launch of the operation, and he did it over and over again. So instead of starting at the end of March, he decided to push it off to April, then into early May, then to mid-June, and finally to early July. Why? Well, there were other generals who convinced him that they needed to build up their forces and allow enough time to bring up new, larger quantities of this ultimate weapons, the Tiger tank and the new Panther tanks, as well as those Elefant or Ferdinand assault guns. As I said last episode, basically they're Tiger chassis with a huge cannon mounted on top. In this corner, the Northern Force was the Ninth Army, commanded by General Walter Model. 223,000 combat soldiers out of a total of 335,000 men. It comprised the 20th Infantry Corps and 3 Panzer or tank corps, the 41st, the 46th, and the 47th. The 1st Flieger Division of Luftflotte 6 provided air support, critical in this operation. In reserve was Group von Esbeck. In total, 22 divisions, infantry, panzer, and panzer grenadier or motorized infantry in armored personnel carriers. In the southern corner was Colonel General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, comprising 3 corps, the 48th Panzer Corps, which included the notorious Grossdeutschland Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Corps of 3 panzer divisions, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by General Paul Hauser, the man who had led the German reconquest of Kharkiv in the 3rd Battle of Kharkiv the previous winter. This corps included the 3 most notorious panzer divisions, the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the SS Das Reich, and the SS Totenkopf, or Death's Head. The Southern Force also included Army Detachment Kempf on the right side of the Panzer Army, which included 2 Army Corps and the 47th Panzer Corps. The 8th Flieger Corps of Luftwaffe 4 provided air support. In total, on both north and south, 750,000 combat troops, plus support personnel, nearly 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 warplanes, 10,000 artillery pieces, and mortars. I went over the comparisons to Operation Barbarossa and Case Blue in the previous episode just to see the numbers. But the point is, Operation Citadelle, it was the last time that the Germans would be able to concentrate so much firepower. And in the opposite corner, for the Soviet Union, the situation in 1943 is much different from 1941. As I mentioned, the Red Army now has over 6 million members, men and women. This is 1 million more than they had in 1941, despite the millions killed and captured since the invasion of Operation Barbarossa. Soviet factories that were moved east out of German bomber range are now churning out guns, warplanes, tanks, and artillery, and all sorts of other material at double the pace of Germany's factories. Lend-Lease is delivering millions of tons of supplies, including ammunition and food. The Red Army is fielding British and American tanks, American jeeps, and Studebaker trucks. Anyone looking at a map in June 1943 knew that the Germans would attack the Kursk salient. On top of that, though, the Soviets had plenty of intel that told them where the Germans would attack. Partisans in occupied territory reported on German troop and armor movement. The British sent some intercepts of German signals done in the Enigma code that they and Polish code breakers had decoded. The Soviets also had another intelligence asset, an anti-Nazi German living in Switzerland, codenamed Lucy. The Soviets knew from several sources where the attack would be and roughly when. Lucy told them it would be between July 3rd and 6th. What did the Red Army do in the meantime? We'll find out right after a short break. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. Beyond Barbarossa is still, as far as I can tell, the only English language podcast in the world that focuses on the Eastern Front of World War II. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland, and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
That was a nice break. Thanks for coming back. I was just about to tell you how the Red Army spent its time while it waited for the attack they knew Germany would launch on the Kursk salient. The Germans had delayed the operation for months, taking the time to build up their strength. So the Soviets did the same thing, building 8 concentric defensive lines in the Kursk salient, anti-tank ditches, 9,000 kilometers of trenches, barbed wire, deep minefields, bunkers, and more. And they moved in 2 complete, not armies, but army fronts, groups of armies. In total, nearly 2 million troops were concentrated into this area of about 100 kilometers by 80 kilometers. In the southernmost part of the salient, General Vatutin commanded the Voronezh front with 5 infantry armies and the 1st Tank Army in reserve. The northern half, or slightly more than half, was under the command of Marshal Rokossovsky, the Central Front, which had 4 infantry armies plus the 2nd Tank Army. The Soviets also brought up the Steppe Army Front as a reserve, stationed just behind or east of the salient. This included 2 Guards armies, 3 infantry armies, and the 5th Guards Tank Army, which is going to play a pivotal role. A total of 1.5 million combat troops plus support personnel. This is twice as many combat troops as the Germans had. Plus, they had 5,128 tanks, over 3,000 aircraft. Accurate numbers are always hard to find when it comes to the USSR. And 25,000 artillery pieces and mortars. In places, there was 1 heavy gun for every 50 meters of front. Now, their plan was very different from the Germans. They weren't trying to advance 100 kilometers. As Antony Beevor, the historian, put it, the plan was to let the Germans impale themselves on Soviet defenses. So here we are, 5th July, 1943. What would turn out to be the eve of battle. 2 massive armies poised to go at each other. For Germany, it's a huge risk. As Robin Cook put it, Hitler staked everything on this roll of the dice. There would be no way, if they lost, to replace the losses. And there was no plan B if things went sideways. According to hurrying Heinz Guderian, now Inspector General of Armor, Hitler told him, quote, "Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over," end quote. Although you really have to question anything that Heinz Guderian said, especially after the war. On the other side, the Soviets are watching, doing air reconnaissance, and sending patrols out at night to capture and question German soldiers. Both air forces are raiding each other. One night in late June, Marshal Rokossovsky decided to visit the other officers' mess hall, have a chat. While he was there, a German bomb destroyed his headquarters, a small cottage he had commandeered. Rocky, and yes, I'm calling him Rocky because it's fun, decided to make his headquarters in underground bunkers from then on. On the night of July 4th to 5th, German sappers crept into no man's land to remove mines. It was difficult, painstaking, dangerous work to clear a path for the panzers and infantry. A Red Army patrol captured some German soldiers. One of these captives was a certain Private Fermello of the 6th Infantry Division. He told his Red Army captors that the attack would begin at 3 a.m. on 5th July, only a few hours later. That night, Georgy Zhukov, who was coordinating the operations of the two fronts, was at the headquarters of his friend Marshal Rokossovsky, commander of the Central Front. At 2 a.m., they received a secure phone call telling them about Private Fermello's confirmation. The attack would begin in an hour. As Zhukov phoned Stalin to report, Rokossovsky ordered a preemptive artillery bombardment. It started at 2:20 a.m., 10 minutes before the Germans had planned to start theirs. Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened up, firing for a half hour. The Germans were surprised and thrown off a little, but they managed to fire back, and by 4:45 a.m. had brought more guns for their counter-battery attack. So Rokossovsky then ordered a second 30-minute bombardment with 1,000 guns. Both bombardments from each side are pretty much ineffective. The Soviets were literally firing in the dark because they didn't know where the Germans exactly were. And on both sides, most of the infantry was dug into their bunkers. So stuff got churned up outside, but the men were mostly safe inside. By 5:30 a.m. on July 5th, the German ground forces were moving ahead on both fronts, north and south. In the north, Model's plan was to use sappers, as I described, to clear the pass through the minefields. 7 infantry and Panzer Grenadier divisions, as well as the 20th Panzer Division, equipped with Tiger tanks and those Elefant armored guns, smashed into the Soviet defenses, to be met by heavy, short-range fire from well-dug-in, hidden emplacements. After 4 hours of trading fire, the Germans realized they were not making that speedy progress they had expected from their experience 2 years earlier. So they sent in Heavy Panzer Battalion 505, which had Tiger tanks, along with supporting motorized infantry. The Tiger's thick armor, powerful gun, and machine guns allowed them to penetrate faster, but they soon outran their supporting infantry. This is not a good situation to be in for a tank. It means they're isolated and vulnerable to infantry attack. At the same time, the Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers took out Red Army gun emplacements, strongpoints, and supply lines. Panzer Jäger or tank hunter planes destroyed T-34 and other Soviet tanks. Red Army fighters and bombers engaged those planes and claimed to take out 106 German planes with a loss of 98 of their own. Antony Brevoort is great at describing things like this from his book, The Second World War. The Stuka ace Hans Rudel experimented with his own invention, a cannon bird, with 2 37mm guns fixed beneath the wings. Other T-34s, unconvincingly disguised as haystacks, were soon dealt with. Crew members who survived the impact of the armor-piercing shells then had to scramble out through blazing straw. German soldiers were thrilled by the effect. Quote, "Our Luftwaffe is really fantastic," end quote, a Hauptfeldwebel in the 167th Infantry Division wrote home. End quote. One German fighter pilot, Warrant Officer Hubert Strassel, claimed to have shot down 15 Red Air Force planes on that day alone, the first day of the attack. But as fearsome weapons as they were, there weren't that many Tigers. And the following Panzer IVs were more vulnerable to anti-tank guns and infantry. Red Army anti-tank squads took out the Panzers with gasoline bombs, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges. Still, by noon, the Germans were threatening a breakthrough on the eastern side of the attack. The Ferdinands, or Elefants, those heavy self-propelled assault guns, essentially mobile pillboxes, were cutting through. Their armor, like the Tigers, was 20 centimeters thick in front and able to repel almost every shell. But they had a major Achilles heel. First, to aim their heavy gun, they had to turn the whole machine, and they didn't have their own machine guns like tanks did. One Elefant battalion ran into an area where Soviets had dug several slit trenches, so a lot of them got stuck or bogged down, and they were stranded without supporting lighter tanks and infantry. Then Red Army soldiers climbed out of their foxholes and other hiding places at close range and shot flamethrowers into the Elefant's ventilation ports. Even as this happened, the Red Army was laying more mines in their way. 6,000 in this sector on that first day alone. By the end of that day, 5th July, the northern attack lost more than 100 tanks and self-propelled guns to mines, and lost more to anti-tank artillery, infantry, and Soviet tanks. The Soviets' preparations were paying off. Unlike in 1941, when so many men succumbed to tank panic, running away at the sight of an advancing Panzer, the Red Army infantry in 1943 stayed in their bunkers and camouflaged hideouts. They let the German armor pass and then emerged to take on the infantry. By nightfall, the Germans had only penetrated 3 or 4 miles on the left and right of the main attack, but had reached the outskirts of the town of Poniuri, about 8 miles or 12 kilometers from their starting point. The Tiger tanks that had pushed through the Soviet defenses so arrogantly were now isolated from supporting Panzer Grenadiers, who were fighting Red Army soldiers emerging from areas the Germans thought they had taken. So that's day one on the northern sector of the Battle of Kursk. Next episode, we'll shift focus to the southern part of the battle. This is the area that epitomizes the most common thinking of how fighting on the Eastern Front took place during the Second World War. This is where the most notorious German divisions are operating, the SS Panzer Division. So, I'll talk to you in 2 weeks from today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. As always, there are maps on the webpage for this particular episode. Just go to beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com and then click on the title of this episode to open up that page. If you like this episode, please consider following Beyond Barbarossa on your preferred podcasting app, and I'd really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, or wherever you listen. That makes me feel good, but it also helps alert other people who might be interested in this part of history about this podcast. I want to thank all who have supported the podcast through Patreon, and you too can become a supporter. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support that you're comfortable with. Patreon supporters get early and ad-free access to episodes. If you have a question, a comment, or, heaven forfend, I really hope not, a correction? If so, please let me know about it. You can reach me by email, contact@beyondbarbarossa.ca, or go to the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. You can also find me, Scott Burry, author, on Instagram and Twitter, or X, as well as Blue Sky. Now, I want to apologize for a really rookie mistake I made last episode. The new music, which I was quite enthusiastic about, came in way too loud at the end of the podcast when I was signing off, and I was describing a little giveaway I was doing, but the music totally drowned it out, and I don't know why I didn't catch that when proofing. So to correct that, if you send me a comment, question, a suggestion, a correction, whatever, by email or through the Facebook page, or you can send me a voice memo by email. All you have to do is record it and then upload it either onto Facebook or into an email. Everyone who does that will get the e-copies of the Eastern Front trilogy, which is the true story of Maurice Burry, a Canadian drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941, just in time for Operation Barbarossa. Also, one of those entries will be selected randomly for a signed physical copy, a paperback of the Eastern Front trilogy. So once again, all you have to do is send me a voice memo or an email or a question to contact@beyondbarbarossa.ca or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. Don't hesitate. Let me know what you think. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina.